So now I have the pleasure of introducing Sandy Artuso. So Sandy is an FNR-funded PhD candidate in the Department of German Studies at the University of Luxembourg. She's writing her thesis about German autobiographies written by trans people. The title is Lunch Hour with Jean, Coccinelle, Simone-Yvonne, Christine, and the others. In the 1950s and 60s, the life stories of several internationally renowned trans persons were widely received throughout Western Europe. The names and stories of Christine Jorgensen, Jan Morris, Coccinelle circulated in mainstream magazines, finding avid readers also among the trans subcultures in Germany. But it was not before the 1980s that the first German autobiographies written by trans people started to appear. Many of these authors relate that they read about famous trans people for the first time and that their narratives helped them to understand themselves. I have also heard this many, many times. Sandy's currently writing her PhD thesis about German autobiographies written between 1980 and 2016. And during her stay at UVic, she's looked at the scope of the international influence on the production of autobiographies in German-speaking countries. In this presentation, Sandy will give an overview of her research project, including the first results of her work from the Transgender Archives. Please join me in welcoming Sandy Artuso.
So, thank you very much for being here. I say also thank you very much for having me here. It was a very, very, very interesting month here, and not only the conference, but also everything around it was very nice. It was really a nice experience to be here. And so it's a real pleasure to finish and to go and have a small presentation of what I have been doing here. I won't touch this again, I think it's too squeaky. So yeah, most of it was already said, so I can skip my first paragraph, which is nice. Yes, my name is Sandy. I have a master's degree in German studies and English studies. I say that because you will see that I will very much focus on literary things, and because that's what I'm trained in. And I would like to talk about some aspects of my current PhD project and the related work I've been doing here in Victoria. I don't know which one of you has been on the conference. Some things you might have heard there if you saw my panel. If not, it's not bad because I'll be able to show more material here. And later on I will guide you through a time travel in a way. So let's start with the scope of my research. I work on German autobiographies written by trans people, and my research scope is narratological and is based in literary theory. That means actually that I'm basically focusing on how are these stories told. And but let's focus on these three criteria to delimit this corpus a bit: German, trans, and autobiography. When I say German, I mean books written originally in German, comprising publications from Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Austria. And well, initially seeing that a critical mass could be found, I decided to focus on books written by self-defining trans people. Now, these are people defining themselves sometimes as transgender, others prefer the term transsexuals, others prefer the term transident, in German, so transident. And when quoting them, I will be strictly using their self-definition, just that you know that. And when I refer to the corpus, I will use trans as an umbrella term. And another important point at this important note at this point, some of the findings will somehow be anchored in binary gender concepts. For example, when I'll be referring to male to female or female to male transitions, again, I will, in that case, I'm paraphrasing and quoting the authors. So in the third point, autobiography, and I just give you the most basic definition, which means that it is a retrospective retelling of one's own existence with focus on the development of one's personality. And that's a really freestyle version of the definition by Philippe Lejeune. So when I say I chose a narratological approach, I mean that I'll be focusing on questions like the agency of the narrator, the focus, focalization, how is time treated in the narrative, and most importantly, how is the inner structure of the plot. And furthermore, try to isolate possible influences on the narrative, being it external, like media in general, and or the social narrative, and of course, influences from within the community. In this case here, meaning specifically, as I call them, international autobiographies of persons like Lili Elbe, Christine Jorgensen, Jan Morris, Coccinelle, but also the medial effect of these people on the people writing the German autobiographies. So, and although my weapons of choice are from the literary studies, I am influenced by queer theory, and when I transcend the literary analysis and try to highlight also concepts of self-determination, voice, gender concepts, and the reconstruction of identities through autobiographies. But let's talk a bit about the Lili Elbe Archive in Berlin, which is an institution I have the pleasure to work with a lot, because that's where I find these books I am studying. The motto of this institution is "Our history belongs to us," and it is an independent institution founded in 2013, so very young, and as they say, committed to the preservation of unique documents in the sphere of German and international history of inter, trans, and queer people. And these items come to the archive via acquisitions, donations, estates, very much like the transgender archives here. And since 2013, it has also been part of the digital transgender archive. Here you can see all the documents they have according to their last counting. So I regularly travel to Berlin to work with the corpus of autobiographies, which I would now like to describe to you, or to present to you, so that you can see how many there are. Oh. Well, I know you can't read that. I just wanted to visualize it. I'll pass around a list. So it's 2 sheets on both sides, and here's another one. It's in German, unfortunately, but just that you can see how many and how much, has been published from 1983 to 2016, and it's 66 German autobiographies. And before that, they were 1980. It's actually 83. I have a typo in it. It says 84, but it's 83. I'm sorry. None were published originally in German. I'll talk later about Lili Elbe and her memoirs. They're a very special case. So let's look into this corpus. 56 of these narrations, the narrator describes, and here I'm quoting, their transition from male to female, while only 10 tell the life stories of female to male trans persons. The publishing year and the age of the authors at publication were also first important systematic aspects. So you can see that only 2 were published in the 80s, and the number keeps rising. In the 90s, we already have 15. And then 20 in the 2000s, and now in the 2010s, already 29. And as you remember, I stopped counting 2016 because I had to limit my scope for the research. But I know of at least 3 more that have been published in 2017, so that this decade will surely exceed 30 published autobiographies. Now the age, you can see here, I'll step it to the side, is also very interesting. Interesting in the sense that you might expect other people to write their autobiographies, where you can see that only 2 in their 80s, 3 in their 70s, and 4 in their 60s. But with the most people writing or in the 50s or in the 40s, even 20 autobiographies have been written by people in their 40s. And also younger persons in their 30s, 17, and also 2 from very young people in their 20s. And another thing that was very interesting to look at is what you can see down there, self-publishing. But it's interesting to see how these books were published. So 22 were published via self-publishing. The others were published in more regular publishing houses. Self-publishing platforms, I'm not sure if you know such concepts in Canada, I'm sure you do. Basically, you send in your finished manuscript, you do the layout, you do everything. They just print it and organize the ISSN number, and it's your job to do the wholesale and marketing. But basically, you send it in, you pay a price, you get the books, and you sell them. So it's a very comfortable way to get published if you don't have the connections to get into a big publishing house. So, for example, the most used platform in Germany is called Books on Demand, which quite adequately resumes their services, I think. And there you can see also these numbers kept rising as these services got more easy to get. So, right at the beginning of my research, the curator of the Lili Elbe archives pointed out to me the similarities of the inner structure of these books, the similarities in the plot, so to say. That many of these books follow the same steps in life and highlighting specific milestones related to the author's coming out, but foremost their transition. I will refer to it as a plot prototype, by which I mean a prototypical way of telling the life stories where these specific milestones are emphasized. Because we have here 66 different life stories from taxi drivers, accountants, artists, carpenters, and nearly 50 stick to that prototype, which I've tried to outline here. You will find what I call a claim of authenticity right in the beginning. That's this moment where the author states to be telling nothing but the whole truth. It's actually the signature move of autobiographies, you might say. But here it's even more emphasized. Then the plot continues with the childhood memories, puberty, but always in relation to moments of dysphoria. And that doesn't need to be in a linear way, but these milestones will appear with always that focus. And then coming out, which leads to the first stage of transition, in that case, the in all cases, hormone therapy. They're related to first contact with medical personnel, first conflicts with medical social systems, and also mostly negative experiences in private, at work. And then follows the narration of the steps leading to gender-confirming surgery, and followed by short-term post-operative experiences and consequences for the private, professional life. While, interestingly, long-term post-operative experiences are rather exceptional in these narrations. It ends with an epilogue, with an explicit, comforting or warning message to the reader, and also some include an appendix with pictures, informations on that. You see, this prototypical narration actually relate more the story of the transition, and the end after the operation, again in nearly 50 of 66 books. Now, this is one dimension of what is often called a trans-narrative, which I went one too far apparently. Oh no, I'm sorry. So, quoting Giulia Serrano in a Guardian article, "It is so common for trans people to be compelled to provide such an account that the phenomenon has its own name. It's called sharing your trans narrative. The story of how you went from being born a boy to becoming a woman, or vice versa." Or even to quote, that's an article from 2015, but already 1987, Sandy Stone, in her seminal post-transsexual manifestos, claimed that making history, whether autobiographic, academic, or clinical, is partly a struggle to ground an account in some natural inevitability. The highest purpose of the transsexual is to erase herself, to fade into the normal population as soon as possible. And that's also what you get from these more prototypical plots in these autobiographies. I like to resume it in that way, that these people show, and that's again paraphrasing a common trope that is used in these plots, how these people were trapped and needed to escape from their predicament, and this escape or salvation in some cases, even was put in that way, was only possible via the complete transformation of the body. And as soon as this part is fulfilled, the story is told and the plot resolved. So in my research, I focus as much as on this plot as also on those that break out of this plot and do more, let's say, untypical narrations. But I won't be talking about those today. I will be talking now about some examples so that you get a bit of feel of it, what I'm actually doing. And then we're going to have a first look at the so-called international influences I was referring to in the beginning. I was following up on this hypothesis that the German autobiographies I was working with might be influenced by famous ones, that those life stories somehow influenced my set of authors. And that's why prior to coming here, I went through all the books again and searched for occurrences of famous, internationally renowned trans person, and I was expecting those. I don't know if you recognize them, Christine Jorgensen, Jan Morris, and Lili Elbe. Lili Elbe, you see here the title in German, Ein Mensch wechselt sein Geschlecht, eine Lebensbeichte, which would translate into a person changes their sex, a life confession. So, plot spoiler here, yes, these also follow a plot structure leading to the climactical transition, but were they really that influential so that the authors named them? And that wasn't not always the case. So, let's talk a bit about Lili Elbe. Lili Elbe, born 1882 and died 1931, is one of the first persons ever to undergo gender-confirming surgery. The Danish painter was first a patient at Magnus Hirschfeld's Institut für Sexualwissenschaften and later underwent surgery in Dresden. She probably died from an infection due to the operation. Her famous autobiography, which you see there, was edited and published by her friend Ernst Hartan Jakobson under his pseudonym Niels Hoyer. So for people interested in narratology, that's very interesting there. You have Ernst, who got her, who was asked by her to edit and publish her works. He did it under a pseudonym, so you have very many levels of author and narrator structures there that you can ask yourself, okay, how much is it still the story of Lili Elbe? But that's another topic. Now, the whole story around her life and this book and how what impact that had in the media, especially in the 30s in Denmark, where she was originally from, is actually the topic of another dissertation that has been published here. I'll just give it a round. It's in German, but maybe you still want to look at. Sabine Meyer looked solely on how what the medial effect of Lili Elbe was in Denmark and around. But now for my set of authors, none of them mention Lili Elbe, and that was a bit surprising to me. Jan Morris, though, refers to the book and describes it as an agonizing story, and there was never said a tale, but also saying that the story of Lili Elbe gave her hope. Now, the next one I was expecting to see in my set of autobiographies is Christine Jorgensen. You might recognize the famous cover, the magazine. Christine Jorgensen, born in 1926, she died 1989, was a US American photographer with, interestingly, also Danish heritage. Author and performer. She came to international notoriety when the details of her hormone therapy and subsequent gender confirmation surgery in Copenhagen were outed by the New York Daily News in December 1952. She later published in 1967 a personal autobiography, hoping to counter what the media had told about her with her own voice. Now, Here we have 3 of the books that are from my set of autobiographies. Here on the left top corner you have Christa Geibel. I translated Trapped in the Wrong Body, a report of a sex change. Now, this is a very special book in the sense that you have clearly Christa Geibel stated here as the author, yet it's the life story of Yvonne Jorgensen, transcribed and written as it said in the prologue, after long talks and using tape recordings and with the authorization of Mrs. Johnson. Again, here you have this. It's a true story and it's validated by the person itself. But it is written in the first person and using past tense. So you would have the impression that it was Yvonne herself writing it, but it was written down by Christa Geibel. So, and they mention Christine Jorgensen. Very interesting also Vera Freiberg, just above me, and I translate the title as Man Enough to Be a Woman, published in 2003. Oh yeah, this one, just briefly back to Christa Geibel and Yvonne Johnson. That's this one was published in 1983, and that's the one I say is the first to be published after a long time in Germany, so the first one in my set. Vera Freiberg is from 2003, and she wrote it when she was in her 70s. So she was a young person in the 50s, and she clearly remembers having seen the article in the German press about Christine Jorgensen and how that was the first contact for her with another trans person. And though she got the dates and details a bit wrong, because she refers to a young officer of the British Navy called Sorensen, who had surgery in Denmark. So but it's clear that she means Jorgensen, and who was, And finally we have here Simone-Yvonne von Butzin, From Superman to a Superwoman, published in 1996. She wrote it when she was in her 50s. She's more specific in her memories and can point to the exact article she first read of Christine Jorgensen, remembering the picture of a gorgeous woman with dark lipstick and a beautiful pearl necklace. Just above is an old picture of her, and actually it's this article that you can actually find online if you go in the online archives of Der Spiegel, which is a very big weekly newspaper in Germany, where they described der Fall Jorgensen, the Jorgensen case. It's not really one of the, from the articles from that time are never really good in that sense that they give a right description of the case, and it's very pathologizing and very patronizing, and and here you see that picture that Simone-Yvonne was referring to. We see Christine with the pearl necklace and above a picture of her as a young man. Now, this article, she writes further, made her realize that she was not alone on this damned world. It wasn't, and that I wasn't crazy either, as I've thought for a long time, because I wish to be a woman. Now, I have to slide in another person, which wasn't on the first slide you saw with Christine Jorgensen, Jan Morrison, and the album. And that is namely Coccinelle. Because while Jorgensen was indeed a huge impact for the 50s and early 60s in Europe, the mid-60s were dominated about the gossip around her. Coccinelle, Jacqueline Charlotte Dufresne, born 1931 and she died 2006. She was a French singer, dancer, artist, and was said to be the first French person to undergo gender confirmation surgery at the legendary Clinique du Parc in Casablanca, under the hands of the even more legendary Dr. Georges Bureau around 1958. She was a star performer in Paris' famous cabarets Madame Arthur and later the Carousel. And she provoked a major internationally received scandal when she married her first husband, Francis Bonnet, in a white wedding in a church in Paris in 1962. It was really a big media organized event. I didn't find a picture, or I couldn't find at this time pictures of it, but they had, I think it was Paris Match, so one of the big magazines in France cover it with a photo session. It's really nice. And they got around, they could do it because she simply had to get baptized again under her name, new name, Jacqueline Charlotte. And the priest was okay with marrying them. Later, the marriage got dissolved, but that was another story. So, and here you see on that side, the article was in the 1962 edition of Confidential magazine. Here retrieved from the database of the Digital Transgender Archives, and that's now an interesting story how I found that article. Because I was going here through German periodicals in the Transgender Archives, and I will say some words about them later. And I saw a reference to another item in the collection of the archives, namely a booklet containing translated into German articles about Coccinelle, conceived for the members of the German grassroots trans association Transcendent. We'll come back to them later. So here in the archives we have this Coccinelle booklet, but unfortunately the translated articles are not dated, so I could only find one, the most obvious one, which was this one, in the Digital Transgender Archives. So, and again, Spiegel makes it easier. They have, as I said, an online archive containing all their back issues, and here also they go back to the story of Coccinelle. This one is from 1966, and this is from 1962. Now, Coccinelle appears in many, let's say yes, many of the autobiographies I'm working with. So, Angelique Nagel here. The title of her book I would translate to Who is Born as a Woman Anyways. One becomes a woman. It's a wordplay with man. I won't go into it. Well, she remembers reading about several famous trans women, also Jen Morris, actually, in a magazine I have not been able to find yet. Romy Haag, over there, the famous performance artist and author of her biography More Than a Woman from 1999. She was inspired after reading about Coccinelle in another German magazine to go herself to Paris and also seek a career in cabaret. Romy Haag would finally open her own very famous Chez Romy in Berlin in the 70s, where many stars of the time came by, and she also had this very mediaized affair with David Bowie, just for the gossip. And on this side you have one of the most virtuous writers of the collection I'm working with, Jean Lessenich, The Transcendent Woman from 2012. She tells how first seeing Coccinelle in her brother's erotic booklets influenced her vision of her own femininity. So she says, my role model was Coccinelle, a French transsexual who performed in cabarets in France, looked like Brigitte Bardot's sister, and had surgery in Casablanca. And then later she says, I chose Coccinelle. I never thought about wanting to be Hannah Arendt. And now, Jen Morris, Conundrum. Jen Morris, born 1926 and still well alive and happy, is a Welsh historian, journalist, specialized in travel writing and author. And she has written books, history books about the British Empire, has accompanied the British Mount Everest expedition in 1953, and most relevant to our context, wrote her first, one should say, autobiography conundrum in 1974. 2 years after she too had gender-confirming surgery at Dr. Bureau's clinic. And I think now may be a good time to have a few words about Casablanca, because I don't know how many of you know the stories around Casablanca. So European historians of trans history, any of the stories, is it from German, from Netherlands or France, it cannot be told without naming Casablanca and Dr. Bureau. After the groundbreaking works of German doctors in the 30s, namely with Lili Elbe, but they had to stop and flee from the Nazis. It was Denmark that came to attention in the 50s with Christine Jorgensen's case showed, but there again also they couldn't continue with operations for foreigners due to the exposure that the Jorgensen case caused. It was starting in the 50s until his death in 1987 that Dr. Bureau and Casablanca became the beacon of hope for trans women wanting to undergo gender-confirming surgery. And let's hear it I'll read out Jan Morris' own words. He didn't bother himself much with diagnosis or pre-treatment and expected handsome payment in advance. But his surgery was excellent. He asked no questions and he imposed no conditions, legal or moralistic. Actually, I invite you to look for a documentary from 2012 named I Am a Woman Now, where, among others, the famous April Ashley and also Jean Lesnish, which you saw before, relate their experience in this clinic and with Dr. Bureau. I mentioned this documentary as I had the pleasure of meeting Alex Bakker, the historian here at the conference, who was one of the researchers for this documentary. So basically it was a known fact that there was this clinic in Casablanca where you could go if you had cash to pay for it. You would stay there for 2 weeks, undergo a very professional surgery by a very competent doctor, and leave the clinic in a new life, in a way. And so some of the authors are... Oh yeah, sorry. They're all here already. So again, I'm covering her. Yvonne Jonsen relates in the first pages of her autobiography, written by Christa Geibel, how she first met another trans woman in a red district bar in Hamburg, and this person told her all about Dr. Bureau and his clinic, and how this option was unaffordable for them. Later in the book, also Jane Morris is referenced as a famous patient of Dr. Bureau. Then Jacqueline G, here on the right. I have loved a lot The Restless Life of a Transsexual Dancer from 1999. That's also a very interesting book in the sense that it has also a very complex auctorial situation. When you start reading it, you're convinced that it is Jacqueline writing a story. But then follows the epilogue where 2 journalists are mentioned who apparently edited Jacqueline's words. And the book has also endnotes commenting the veracity of Jacqueline's words. And so, for example, in the text, she states that every transsexual in our scene knows about Dr. Bureau, followed by an endnote, a number referring to an endnote. And in the epilogue, the comment is underlying the truth of this by comparing Jacqueline's statements on Bureau with the words of Jan Morris in Conundrum. And Conundrum is explicitly named in Vera Freiberg's autobiography, where she tells us that Conundrum was the first book about a trans woman that fell into her hands, and how it changed her life, showing her that a future as she wants it is possible. She comments, though, that one has to have certain financial privileges, as Jan Morris had, to be able to do it in Casablanca, and that not everybody has the means to go there. Similarly, Jean Lesnish, She also praises the importance of conundrum. Interestingly, in her case, is that she read it after having had herself been to Casablanca. But she comments in her memoirs that though it made John Morris socially acceptable, she says, it didn't necessarily work out that way for others, less class privileged people. She also, Jan references Fatima, the head nurse of the clinic, playfully called the mistress of the knives by Jan Morris. And there are even more authors who reference Dr. Beroux, more authors from the set of autobiographies I'm working with. Even one of the trans men, Kai Wolfgang Hansmann, mentions having read her autobiography because it was what he could find about the topic. I will briefly mention another person, which is another famous person, Amanda Lear. I don't know how many of you know her. Well, she's a French-Italian singer, and since the 80s, rumor have been shared about through the yellow press and in the media that she's supposedly a trans woman, which she's always denied. Nevertheless, this fake news found their way in many European magazines of the 80s, so that 3 of the German autobiographies, 3 of the writers mention her as being the first alleged trans person they had heard of. So quite interesting. So we've been in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and now we're somehow in the 80s. And just take a few more minutes to talk about the 80s and early 90s in Germany and what I found out about community life in Germany, especially here in Victoria. People interested in the community life of trans people in Germany and also around Germany know that before the 80s, no regional or even less national peer structures were available. You were more or less on your own, in the sense that there were no organizational structures. There were activists fighting for the rights of trans people, like the lawyer Maria Sabine Augstein. She started fighting for the rights of trans people in the 70s, together with other individuals spread out through the Republic. Their fight actually culminated in the creation of a law regarding name change and the legal gender change, which is colloquially called the trans law. In its original formulation, it required hormonal and chirurgical intervention of the person wanting a legal gender change. Some of these have been changed by decisions of the Supreme Court in Germany, but it is still valid in its form, and it's still contested, and it's undergoing an update right now, which should be coming in the next years, hopefully. But what's interesting here is that it wasn't until the mid-80s, with the creation of Transidentitas, that organizational life for trans people started in a way. They started first in Frankfurt or near Frankfurt in Offenbach, and then expanded through regional seats or through Germany. And this organization, Transidentitas, they also published a magazine for their members from 1988 till the late 90s. I cannot confirm the end date. I have to check with the Lily Elbe archive because I wasn't sure when the last was published. But what's interesting here is that it's, on one hand, it shows how the trans community in the 80s worked and how they communicated among each other, but also internationally, because this magazine and the Transgender Archive has actually 10 issues of their magazine Transidentitas. You can see very nicely how they provide information for others, how they they organize social events, but also how they tend out to international exchanges, first with France, Switzerland, the UK, but also with the United States, for example. And so in one of the issues you can read their contact with the organizer of the Fantasia Fair and how it led to the organization of the Euro Fantasia Fair in 1993, actually. And comparably in Munich, around what was it? Also in the mid 80s, another group was founded, a peer support group called Viva TS Munich, and they also published a magazine called Vivatissimus from 1993 till 2006. And actually Simone-Yvonne von Butzin, which we saw before, who wrote the autobiography Superman to Superwoman, was long time a board member and editor of this organization. So what's interesting here that these started to get organized in the 80s and share and exchange ideas and get together. And after the law was how do you call that, decreed. And it's also interesting because I have no autobiography that had been published before the 80s. So it's this critical moment in the history of trans people in Germany and around, because it's quite similar for Austria and Switzerland, that before the legal structure was set, it was very, very difficult to share, to get to know each other, and to go public, actually. So actually, I'm coming to an end now, because that's what I took from here, because funnily enough, I had to come to Victoria to to work with these magazines, because I know that there are some in the Lily Elbe archive. But here I had them. First, I just wanted to go through them to see what's in it, and then I noticed all this interesting stuff in it, like autobiographies I have in my set being reviewed in their magazines, how they interact with each other, Transcendentitas and Vivatissimus, mostly very cooperatively. Sometimes they had fights, and it helped me get a context of the societal context of the 80s prior to the publication of the first, or for my case, what I think is the first autobiography written by German people. And so I really don't have a last word in that sense, but I think that's a nice thing for me, because I know now what I can take from it and where I can go with it, is that I know that it's very, very interesting what happened in the 80s, and I have to focus on that to understand more what led to the publication of all these autobiographies. Wow, that's it so far for me, and now I'm open for questions.